Good afternoon. Do you hear me? No. No? Okay. Hello. Okay. Good afternoon. Nice to see you here. My director, Haralambos Touloumis, is not able to attend, so he sends his apologies. But let me not waste time and call Professor Daria Smirnova or Smirnova. It's not professor. Assistant professor. Okay. Who will present performance deficits for action but not mental state, verbal fluency in schizophrenia spectrum disorders.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsopoulos, for this kind...
It's also not professor, it's doctor.
Oh, thank you. That, you know, we are kind to each other. Okay. So, dear professors, dear colleagues, first of all, let me express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to be here and to attend and to contribute to this very important scientific event. My presentation or lecture is devoted to verbal fluency in schizophrenia as a potential endophenotypic marker of this disorder. In the first part of my presentation, I will be talking about the role of language in schizophrenia research. And in the second part of the lecture, I will be focusing on particular findings of our study, where we found that there is selective semantic impairment within verbal fluency, and that schizophrenia patients experience a difficulty in action verbs generation, but surprisingly not with mental state verbs production. So what is schizophrenia? As Spence called that it is one of the most extreme states that human beings can inhabit. ICD-10 states that schizophrenia is a fundamental disturbance of personality involving its most basic functions, which give the normal person a feeling of individuality, uniqueness, and self-direction. I would remind you the very famous quote by Eugen Bleuler, who wrote that schizophrenia is not a disease in the strict sense, but appears to be a group of diseases. Therefore, we should speak about schizophrenias in the plural. In his paper on subtyping of schizophrenia, Professor Arsen Jablensky wrote, schizophrenia is not a nosological monolith, but rather an assembly of syndromes structured into relatively distinct subtypes of this disorder. The course of this disorder is not inevitably associated with deterioration. 61.4% of patients had multiple episodes with complete or either partial remissions, while only 30% experience continuous disabling illness with serious deterioration. The findings related to social support, daily living, and community function cause serious concern because the majority of schizophrenia patients are unemployed, report difficulty in socializing outside their home, and 30% of patients live alone, are living alone. Indeed, schizophrenia is characterized by a variability of clinical phenotypes and extensive genetic heterogeneity. Despite the century of research, the multifactorial causes and biological underpinnings of schizophrenia and related disorders are still poorly understood. The professional psychiatric community is discussing now the research which posts that multiple biological pathways lead to similar symptoms. So this is the direction of endophenotype research. This is the quote from a National Institute of Health funded study published in 2016 by Brett Clements from University of Georgia, United States. Center of Clinical Research in Neuropsychiatry was established in the University of Western Australia in 1995, and the search of endophenotypic markers related to diagnostic and prognostic subtypes of schizophrenia is one of the most promising schizophrenia research directions today and the leading research direction of CCRN team. The Western Australian Family Study of Schizophrenia is an important and long-term project initiated in 1996 with the aim of deconstructing the heterogeneity of schizophrenia as a unitary disease and subtyping the clinical phenotype on the basis of its underlying neurocognitive endophenotypes. While the phenomenological core of schizophrenia is a profound alteration of the sense of self, manifested in thought and language abnormalities, impaired social communication, delusions, and hallucinations, we subscribe to the view that schizophrenia is first and foremost a cognitive illness, while psychosis is a secondary or associated part of it. Western Australian Family Study of Schizophrenia recruited families with more than one member affected with schizophrenia disorder, spectrum disorders such as schizophrenia, pure schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, schizotypal disorder, and acute transient psychosis with schizophrenia symptoms. The cohort of Western Australia Family Study Schizophrenia includes at present 557 schizophrenia probants, 439 first-degree relatives, and 445 healthy controls. So, Professor Jablensky and team discovered two subtypes of pure types of schizophrenia, cognitive deficit and cognitively spared. It was published already in 2006, and the research is continuing. And on this slide, I just would like to mention what is endophenotype, and just to remind you that endophenotypes are subsets of biomarkers representing measurable components unseen by the unaided eye along the pathway between disease and distal genotype. So endophenotypes associated with illness, but not part of its diagnosis. They're heritable, they're occupying the terrain between disease symptoms and risk genotypes, they are state independent, they are co-segregating with illness in families and found in unaffected relatives at higher rate than in the general population. Why do we pay attention to language studies in schizophrenia? Diagnosis of schizophrenia still remains primarily based on symptoms, on self-reported subjective experiences. There are few objective signs presented through thought and language disorder. Language represents both signs of impairments given in speech, in patient speech, and a tool to access psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia. Again, Bleuler wrote, we are forced to deduce most of the anomalies from the oral and written production of the patients. Primary symptoms of schizophrenia find their expression in language, but here the abnormality lies not in language itself, but in the way it has to say. Already Kraepelin described language phenomena in schizophrenia. You also remember all these famous quotes about derailment in the expression of thoughts in speech, disorders in connected speech, and confused syntax, derailments in linguistic expression form especially important domain in speech disorders of dementia praecox and influence in a morbid way the form of the speech. Also, Karl Kleist mentioned that there are multiple discrete types of schizophrenia, that the thought disorder is some kind of dysphasia, when comprehension is unaffected. The speech expression is similar to frontal motor aphasia, Broca's aphasia, and paraphasias are similar to temporal lobe aphasia, Wernicke's word amnesia. Also, Cameron identified the phenomena of acidentic thinking. He described over-inclusiveness of schizophrenia patients' speech, their metonymic distortions, or using such called word approximations. Ellen Chaik described in details one patient speech, and she concluded that language dysfunction is some sort of intermittent aphasia. Also interesting is the hypothesis by Tolving about the semantic hypothesis, it's named, and about semantic hyperpriming, increased retrieval and intrusion of inappropriate normal associations. Peter McKenna and Thomasina wrote about formal thought disorder, which is primarily a disorder of pragmatics, failure to use context meaning, or failure to take account of the needs of the listener. Nancy Andreasen was the first who introduced language criteria to DSM-3 classification. She described 18 symptoms of language and communication dysfunction in schizophrenia, and really we like this title, this name for this dysfunction, thought, language and communication disorder in schizophrenia. And among them you can see this symptoms of poverty of speech, poverty of content of speech, pressure of speech, distractible speech, derailment, incoherence, and others. And of course, not all of them are related to schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and they are associated with other psychotic experiences. This research by Andreasen and Groove showed that we could call it as the most pathognomonic language symptoms for schizophrenia, those like poverty of speech, like tangentiality, derailment, and incoherence. Language criteria of schizophrenia varied and has been changed over the editions of statistical classifications of mental disorders. So in DSM-4 we saw positive symptoms of the disorganization dimension, disorganized speech such as frequent derailment. Previously it was called topic shifting and incoherence, and negative symptoms domain with related to restrictions in fluency, like blocking, interruption of speech, and productivity of speech, like alagia. Previously it was poverty of speech and poverty of content of speech. In DSM-5 we have the basic criterion A, point 3 of the rubric schizophrenia, disorganized speech, frequent derailment, and incoherence. ICD-10 includes more symptoms of language dysfunction, such as neologisms, breaks, and interpolation in the train of thought, incoherence, irrelevant speech, and paucity in speech. I can't mention this famous paper by Professor Timothy Crow, who stressed the role of language in developing psychosis, and in particular schizophrenia. His famous paper published in 100 words called Psychosis is the price that Homo sapiens pays for language in the process of evolution. Yes, indeed, we have this destruction of reality. We have the world of objectives, we have the material world, and we have also the world of naming the objective things. So there is a chance to be lost between names and the things itself, what Professor Timothy Crow might mean by this also. Language abnormalities in schizophrenia are genetically determined. It is well known that clinical and affected relatives experience deviant use of language, semantic impairment, and communication anomalies, as Deborah Levy and colleagues posted in 2010. And it is also consistent with the disintegration theory of schizophrenia. Language and semantic, in particular semantic dysfunction, is a failure to integrate linguistic and related sensory motor, perceptual, and affective experiences and memories in the whole entity of the object representation in the mind. Leading impairments in schizophrenia lie in the field of semantics and pragmatics. So the key feature of deviant verbalization in schizophrenia is anomalous semantics. We can mention here different kind and different project design studies which concluded about impaired semantic fluency, abnormal semantic activation, and impaired use of context, difficulty noticing semantic violation in sentences, excessive semantic activation during the initial stages of word processing, semantic errors, and etc. I would also like to remind you normal aspects of conversational speech. By the way, it's my attempt to conversate with Krepelin in Munich. So, first of all, it's spontaneity. Utterances occur spontaneously, not only as a response to questions. Also, the normal trait of conversational speech, it's fluency, as non-fluent speech is halting and laborious, often with poor articulation. It is also a tone-taking, so speaker and listener take tones. It's not the monopolized conversation. It is mutual topic, so staying on the topic or focus, no strain or perseveration. It is comprehension. Each participant understands the utterance of the other, making sense. So speech that is not understandable despite adequate articulation indicates a cognitive problem of the speaker, and of course associated behavior, facial expressions, gestures, body language, conveying conversational information. Decline in verbal fluency is a characteristic finding in schizophrenia involving a combination of mechanisms, including the basic ones such semantic processing skills, difficulties using context, and executive dysfunction. Semantic fluency deficit has previously been already proposed as a potential endophenotypic marker in schizophrenia, but the majority of previous studies have focused on object words, e.g. nouns, rather than action words, verbs. There was one of the first studies by the team of Professor Arsen Jablensky and the leading researcher Professor Joanna Bedcock about action fluency deficit reported in schizophrenia spectrum disorders. They found that action fluency deficit is related to clinical symptoms of odd speech, constricted affect, and increased social anxiety, but not to hallucinations and delusions. So mostly to cognitive problems than psychotic experience. And with really a joint effect on social interaction skills. As you know, action verb fluency tasks is a very easy administered instrument developed to measure the verb retrieval ability, drawing on evidence of a dissociation in the neural system supporting the generation of verbs versus nouns. Indeed, common and proper nouns are primarily represented in posterior and anterior temporal regions, respectively, whereas retrieval of verbs relies on the integrity of frontal neural circuits. Agrammatic aphasics with frontal lobe compromise demonstrated deficits in verb retrieval despite preserved noun retrieval. In contrast, patients with anomic aphasia, temporal lobe dysfunction, demonstrated greater difficulties with noun retrieval than verb retrieval. A very interesting study was published in Nature in 2016. This is the semantic atlas of the cerebral cortex, which suggests that topographical differences in brain activation are driven by word meaning, so by semantics. Action versus object semantics, I would stress it, rather than grammatical class per se, like verbs versus nouns. Then there was proved the neural separability of semantic classes of verbs in the brain, so already within the verbs. So there are different neural underpinnings underlying abstract versus concrete verbs and high motion versus low motion verbs in normal population. The neural and anatomical systems involved in processing concrete action verbs, e.g. to run, to poke, for example, or abstract mental state verbs, e.g. to think, to desire, is still a matter of considerable debate. But processing action and mental state verbs involves dissociable cortical networks that are flexibly engaged in representing the sensory, motor, and affective features of actions and the abstract motives driving those actions. Besides semantics, lexical characteristics of words also influence the verb's performance. For example, word length. Shorter words are easier to produce than longer words. Also, there is a word frequency effect. Word frequency is the number of occurrences of a word in a linguistic corpus. So in healthy people, higher frequency verbs, so more frequent verbs, are recognized and produced faster and more accurately than lower frequency verbs. Also, there is a lexical characteristic like valence. This is the emotional property of verbs, which reflects the pleasantness of the stimulus. So a faster response to words with positive meaning was reported. So, for example, we can see that verb think has a higher valence, for example. Also, age of acquisition mostly affects the verb retrieval. Age of acquisition is the age in years when the verb was acquired by a kid. In healthy individuals, early acquired verbs tend to be retrieved faster than later acquired words. Patients with schizophrenia generated words with a lower average age of acquisition through similar frequency and word length on a semantic animal fluency task, so on noun task, compared to controls. And action verbs, such as those associated with the leg, e.g. kick, walk, and mouth, e.g. bite, lick, are typically acquired earlier than mental state verbs, denoting states of cognition, think, pretend, emotion, like love in normal participants. Early learned action verbs have a systemic and meaningful link to body parts, hence are tightly coupled to motor actions and more certain meanings acquired through actions experience or action observation in communication with mother, of course, first. And mental state verbs are acquired through linguistic interactions, not through experience of actions, real actions. By the way, I remember the patient which I consulted several days before the Congress. It was a case of untreated schizophrenia I haven't asked her to perform this action fluency task, but I just hear what she was saying in her natural flow speech. She told me, I don't know, I don't know, there is something in my head, but I don't know what to do. I know how, but I can't do. So if I, you will understand it better when I conclude the study. So she was okay with her mental state verbs, but she experienced negative connotation about action, real action verbs. And the last lexical characteristic is concreteness. Concreteness is the degree to which the concept denoted by a word refers to a perceptible entity. So something which can be experienced directly through your senses or actions. Concrete words are easier to remember than abstract words because they activate perceptual memory codes in addition to verbal codes. Also, action verb fluency is correlated not just with semantics, not just with lexical characteristic of these verbs, but also with general cognitive abilities. So it is known that intelligence and education are positively correlated with verb production, whilst verbal fluency appears to decrease with age or increase in the age. There's another opposite study. And action fluency is associated with measures of working and semantic memory, response inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. So among our study hypotheses, I would stress the second one, which also the first one here on the slide, that the patient will generate both fewer action verbs and fewer mental state verbs compared to healthy control, with a larger effect size for mental state verbs due to their greater cognitive demands. That's what we thought about when planned the study. So we've investigated linguistic characteristic of action fluency test responses using archival data from the Western Australian Family Study Schizophrenia in 46 patients with schizophrenia spectrum disorders and 76 healthy controls. We didn't include those who were poor in fluency in English, so native speakers only, and who were not well educated, so education less than 8th grade education was excluded. This is the standard cognitive battery of Western Australia Family Studies Schizophrenia. We analyzed the clinical state, evaluated the clinical state of patient using diagnostic interview for psychosis with 98 items. And healthy participants were also screened using brief psychosis screen. We also used the schizotypal personality questionnaire to measure personality traits of patient and the battery of cognitive measures, measuring attention, working memory, verbal memory, inhibitory control, and also handedness. This is just a reminder again about standard instruction on active verb fluency tasks. I would like you to tell me as many different things as you can think that people do. I do not want you to use the same word with different endings like eat, eaten, eating. Also just give me single words such as eat or run rather than a sentence. Can you give me one example of something that people do? So patient gives an example and then patient have to name verbs as much as he or she can, limited to the period of 60 seconds. Then performance scored by summing the correct verb responses, number of repeated word responses, and number of intrusions, so non-verb responses. So these are the examples of schizophrenia, excerpt and healthy control. You can see here that action fluency deficit already visually you can see it. And all correct and repeated verb responses, there was 2,219 verbs, were evaluated according to their relevant semantic properties using Bett-Levin's taxonomy of English verbs. Bett-Levin is a very famous professor from Stanford who created this English verb classification. And then we subdivided it into two superordinate semantic categories. Action verbs refer to concrete observable actions, and mental state verbs are defined as verbs whose meaning relates to understanding, discovering, planning, and deciding, so internal experience such as know, feel, believe. And beside the category of psychological state verbs, also the mental state verbs include verbs of perception, to see, to hear, verbs of cognition, think, guess, and emotion, love, adore, and etc. Iterator reliability of verbs was high. So we have iterator reliability for a random sample, and for the whole sample there were experts from English Department of English and English Literature from Bar-Ilan University, and another one was from Harvard University from the psycholinguistic laboratory, and we found that the iterator agreement was high and strong. It was kappa 0.905. This is just an example how we separated verbs to two superordinate categories. For example, eat, breathe, walk, play, the action verbs, and see, hear, smell, think, mental state verbs. And preliminary comparisons showed that healthy controls were older, had completed more years of education, and demonstrated higher IQ, memory, executive function, and attention test scores, but did not differ in gender distribution compared to schizophrenia group. The results showed medium to large effect sizes across all cognitive measures. Our main finding that the main effect of verb category was significant. On average, a higher percentage of action verbs was generated compared to mental state verbs in both group, in schizophrenia and healthy controls. And as predicted, percentage of action verbs generated was significantly lower in schizophrenia compared to healthy control. However, percentage of mental state verbs produced by schizophrenia patients was not significantly different. Then we looked at the pure schizophrenia group. There were 36 patients, and they showed the similar pattern. So, but the sample size was small, and the full analysis was underpowered. So it's for further studies. But patients with schizophrenia, with pure schizophrenia, if 20 diagnoses by NICD produce fewer action verbs than healthy control, but percentage of mental state verbs does not differ. This is about lexical characteristic of action versus mental state verbs in the whole sample. Within the whole sample, action verbs compared to mental state verbs generated were characterized by a shorter word length, so they're easy to reproduce. That's why there were more action verbs in both groups than mental state verbs, lower word frequency, an earlier age of acquisition, again, age of acquisition effect, so they produce more action verbs, both groups, than mental state verbs, and higher concreteness ratings. Again, it's easier to reproduce concrete words rather than more complex abstract words. But it did not differ in violence. But when we focused on action verbs in schizophrenia and healthy controls, non-parametric tests, because of the distribution, indicate that the action verbs produced by schizophrenia patients had lower concreteness ratings. So these verbs were more abstract, less concrete in schizophrenia patients than action verbs produced by healthy controls. But they did not differ between the two groups in other lexical characteristics. So just the concreteness was in the focus of difference between the groups. What about relationship with demographic, clinical, and cognitive measures of action verb fluency and mental state verb fluency. Neither age nor medication dose were significantly associated with either action fluency or mental state verbs generation. In contrast, education and general intelligence were positively correlated with action verb generation. And mental state verbs fluency was not significantly correlated with any of the SPQ domains, but action fluency was significantly negatively correlated with the interpersonal domain of the schizotypal personality questionnaire, comprising the scale of social anxiety, no close friends, and constricted affect, but not with other SPQ domains. Significantly and positive action fluency was significantly and positively correlated with immediate and delayed recall scores, but not with inhibitory control and attention as in previous studies in the normal population, or motor speed and laterality. So this is about the conclusion and discussion. The main finding is that schizophrenia patients produced less verbs in total on action fluency task compared to healthy controls. And they produce, I think then you will remember after this presentation, the action verbs in schizophrenia the percentage was lower in schizophrenia patients compared to healthy controls, but mental state verbs, they didn't differ. But it was not due to an effect of medication, because chlorpromazine dose was unrelated, not correlated with fluency. This finding also was not due to poor reliability of semantic categorization, because inter-rate reliability was high. It was not due to low intelligence. We found the correlations with low intelligence and education of schizophrenia patients, but it was not due to it, as we think, because the number of intrusions, non-verb responses, was small and did not differ. So patients understood the task and they produced verbs, not other words, on action fluency task. And another thing, schizophrenia patients produced selectively low action verbs and the same, not lower mental state verbs. So if they were less educated, poor educated, and it was due to their lower intelligence, they will reproduce both action verb category, less action verbs, and mental state verbs, but they did not. It was not due to age-related decline in fluency performance, because schizophrenia patients were younger than healthy controls, and they should produce more verbs than mature healthy controls. And it was not due to verb difficulty effects, because mental state are complex, are difficult to reproduce, not action verbs. Another finding about the concreteness. So schizophrenia patients produce action verbs which were less concrete, more abstract than in healthy control. We think that it's related to a greater difficulty with precision of encoding or reactivating perceptual memory codes, so their experience of real action associated with the root level verb meaning, conveying the uniqueness of individual verbs. And it is could be related to patients' greater difficulty integrating this integration theory of schizophrenia, integrating verbal and perceptual semantic representation associated with the concrete meaning of action verbs. Also, action verbs correlated with memory and IQ, not with inhibitory control and attention. So action verbs production rely on memory of actions and experience of actions. So we can associate it also with psychomotor retardation, a psychomotor poverty in schizophrenia. And in our future research, we are interested whether the degree of sensory motor impairment could predict the action verb fluency deficit in schizophrenia patients. We became a little bit crazy, as linguists are, who take one word and then find many things just discovering one word. And the last main finding that, but not least, that conversely action but not mental state verb fluency was negatively correlated with interpersonal schizotypy traits. And there was an amazing study by Trop and Lieberman in 2010. They showed that increased sense of psychological distance from other is related to less concrete words. So less concrete words are related to the sense of psychological, emotional, and physical distance. So we find using schizotypal personality questionnaire this interpersonal domain related to action fluency deficit, and we also discussed it in terms of psychological distance and its relationship to concreteness of as a lexical characteristic of verb. So action verb fluency could act as an indicator of poor interpersonal functioning. So conclusions that impaired action verb but intact mental state verb generation is consistent with the neural separability of these processes. I would stress again here disintegrated semantics in schizophrenia and points to a specific relationship between action-related language, action verbs, memory deficits, and poor interpersonal functioning in schizophrenia spectrum disorders. This is our team, Melanie Clark, Professor Joe Badcock, and Professor Asen Jablensky. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for time.
It's okay. We started a little later, so we know we are running late, and but I think we have time for one or two questions or comments from the audience.
Okay.
Yes.
Can
we have the microphone? Okay. Yes.
Hope I will be able to answer.
We know that schizophrenics have a great deficit in the sense of their agency, that they are not the agent of their acts. So I found very interesting that in your study, they produce more action verbs. But this is good.
Thank you. Thank you. So now we are going to continue our research, and also we will involve communication checklist, self-report, and we will check language and communication dysfunction on different levels, the level of pragmatics, semantics, and social engagement. I hope we will find also some relationships with action fluency and deficit as a potential and a phenotypic marker. So it's a rather easy task, just 60 seconds you can check, and also it could be a not expensive task. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. We can continue with the dinner, I think.